Dear followers, the events that took place between January 13th and 18th completely eliminated Trump's influence over Canada. A $3 billion agricultural export agreement was signed with Beijing. A $400 million defense and infrastructure partnership agreement was made with Doha. By 2030, 50 million tons of LNG will be exported annually to Asian markets, bypassing American terminals entirely. And now, a continental rail network transports Canadian products to Mexico without ever touching American soil. Mark Carney rewrote Canada's economic geography in 5 days, and Washington did not see it coming. Trump thought 35% tariffs would force Canada to capitulate. Instead, Carney built alternative trade routes that made American approval unnecessary. With the canola deal alone, China's tariffs will drop from 84% to 15% by March 1st. This is not a bargain. This is the elimination of the United States, Canada's second largest export market. Consider what this means for the claim that Canada needs America more than America needs Canada. Let us examine how Trump created the conditions for his own exclusion from Canadian trade strategy. Throughout 2025, the Trump administration imposed escalating tariffs on Canadian goods. 25% in March, 35% by August, sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, softwood lumber, copper. The stated justification centered on fentanyl flowing across the northern border, though Customs and Border Protection data showed only 0.6% of total fentanyl seizures originated from Canada. The real motivation became clear when Trump repeatedly suggested Canada should become America's 51st state. This was not trade policy. This was attempted economic coercion disguised as border security. Canada's effective tariff rate under USMCA exemptions remained around 5.9%, far below the headline 35% rate. But the uncertainty itself proved damaging. Investment decisions delayed, supply chains disrupted, business confidence eroded. Trump assumed this pressure would force Canadian capitulation. He miscalculated badly. Mark Carney, who became Prime Minister in March of 2025 after Justin Trudeau's resignation, adopted a fundamentally different approach than his predecessor. Where Trudeau engaged in tit-for-tat retaliation, Carney pursued strategic diversification. He recognized that responding to Trump's chaos with Canadian counter-tariffs merely deepened North American trade dysfunction without creating alternatives. So Carney went elsewhere. His government concluded agreements with Ecuador and Indonesia, signed investment deals with the United Arab Emirates, restarted trade negotiations with India after diplomatic freeze under previous government, accelerated talks with Philippines, Thailand, Mercosur, Saudi Arabia, and then came the Beijing trip, first visit by Canadian Prime Minister to China since 2017. The timing was not coincidental, with Trump threatening to eliminate USMCA protections during the scheduled 2026 review. Carney needed concrete alternatives before entering those negotiations. Beijing provided exactly that. But here is where mainstream analysis misses the crucial point. This was not simply trade diversification for its own sake. Every deal Carney signed in Beijing and Doha directly targets infrastructure and supply chains that previously required American intermediation. The mechanics of Canada's bypass strategy reveal sophisticated understanding of how to make American leverage structurally irrelevant. Start with the agricultural sector. China is a $4 billion market for Canadian canola seed. Under the preliminary agreement announced January 16th, Chinese tariffs dropped from 84% to 15% by March 1st this year. Anti-discrimination tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas lifted from March through at least year-end. $3 billion in export orders unlocked for Canadian farmers and fish harvesters. That is the headline. Now, consider the strategic architecture. For decades, Canadian agricultural exports to China moved through American logistics networks or faced Chinese tariffs kept artificially high due to Washington pressure on Beijing regarding North American supply chains. Carney's deal eliminates both constraints simultaneously. Canadian canola now moves directly to Chinese ports at competitive tariff rates, with no American infrastructure involved and no American veto possible. Transportation routes from Saskatchewan and Manitoba connect through Vancouver and Prince Rupert terminals to Asian markets, shorter shipping distances than American Gulf Coast, lower transport costs, faster delivery times, and most importantly, zero exposure to American tariff policy or port congestion. The agricultural deal provides template. Now examine the broader infrastructure. Canada committed to producing 50 million tons of LNG annually by 2030, all destined for Asian markets. LNG Canada facility in Kitimat shipped its first cargo in June 2025, 14 million tons per year capacity operational. Cedar LNG and wood fiber LNG projects under construction, expected online by 2028. Kasai Lisum's LNG, pursuing final investment decision this year with 12 million tons annual capacity. These are not aspirational targets. These are funded projects with binding offtake agreements and Asian buyers already secured. Compare this to American LNG. Gulf Coast terminals face longer shipping routes to Asia, higher transport emissions, Panama Canal congestion, and most critically, European buyers increasingly questioning long-term reliability of American energy supplies, given political volatility every 4 years. Canadian LNG wins on logistics, wins on emissions intensity using hydroelectric power, and wins on political reliability. Asian markets are recognizing this. Japan, South Korea, China, all signing long-term purchase agreements with Canadian producers while American LNG searches for buyers. Then examine CPKC Rail, the continental network that Trump inadvertently weaponized against himself. The 2023 merger of Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern created first and the only single-line rail service connecting Canada, United States, and Mexico. 32,000 kilometers of track. The original business case assumed growing integration of North American manufacturing under USMCA. Trump's tariffs destroyed that assumption, so CPKC pivoted. The railway now markets itself as land bridge, allowing Canadian and Mexican companies to trade with each other while simply passing through American territory without stopping. Oats from Saskatchewan move directly to Monterey. Mexican produce travels straight to Ontario. Automotive parts flow between Canadian assembly plants and Mexican factories in closed-loop supply system. American ports see none of this traffic. American logistics companies handle none of this freight. American customs collects none of these fees. The network physically crosses American soil, but economically bypasses American participation entirely. This is structural transformation, not temporary adaptation. Rail infrastructure lasts decades. Once Canadian and Mexican companies establish direct supply relationships through CPKC, those relationships become embedded in procurement systems and long-term contracts. Even if Trump's successor eliminates tariffs, the bypass infrastructure remains operational and increasingly cost-competitive compared to routes that involve American intermediaries. Now layer in the Doha component. Carney's January 18th visit to Qatar marked first-time sitting Canadian Prime Minister visited the Gulf state. Agreements signed covering aerospace, defense, artificial intelligence, infrastructure investment. Qatar's investments in Canada growing 20% per year. Two-way trade exceeds $325 million, with significant expansion planned. Defense cooperation particularly noteworthy. Canada establishing defense attaché office in Doha. Security best practices exchange related to FIFA World Cup 2026. But the underlying strategic logic is capital access. Qatar possesses enormous sovereign wealth seeking stable democratic partners with resource assets and advanced technology capabilities. Canada offers precisely that. And critically, these investment flows do not require American approval, American financial intermediation, or American strategic alignment. Gulf capital flowing into Canadian critical minerals, LNG infrastructure, renewable energy projects creates alternative funding sources for national development that traditionally depended on American investment or American market access to attract capital. Critics argue Canada remains structurally dependent on American economy. 70% of Canadian exports still go to United States. You cannot simply replace largest trading partner overnight. Geography and supply chain integration make decoupling impossible. These objections miss the strategic point entirely. Carney is not attempting total decoupling. He is eliminating American veto power over Canadian economic decisions. The distinction is crucial. By securing alternative buyers for key commodities like LNG, canola, lumber, by building physical infrastructure that bypasses American ports and logistics networks, by attracting non-American investment capital, Canada reduces Washington's ability to use tariff threats as coercive leverage. Even if 70% of trade continues flowing to the United States, the existence of viable alternatives for the marginal 20 to 30% fundamentally alters negotiating dynamics. Trump assumed Canada had no choice but to accept American demands. Carney just proved that assumption wrong. Now consider the cruel irony Trump created for his own country. American border communities that built their economies around Canadian trade traffic are hemorrhaging revenue. Cross-border tourism from Canada dropped 40% in February 2025 compared to prior year. Retail businesses in Buffalo, Detroit, Seattle suffering as Canadian shoppers stayed home. Logistics companies losing contracts as freight reroutes. Port authorities seeing tonnage declines. Trump's tariffs were supposed to hurt Canada. Instead, they are devastating American border regions, while Canada builds alternative trade routes that will permanently reduce traffic through those communities. Washington's dysfunction has become Canada's opportunity. The infrastructure Carney is building will outlast any administration in Washington. Rail networks operate for decades. LNG terminals serve 50-year contracts. Agricultural trade relationships become embedded in food security planning. These are not temporary responses to Trump's tariffs. These are permanent structural shifts in Canadian economic geography. Trump thought he was negotiating from a position of strength. He was actually accelerating Canadian independence from American economic architecture. Beijing and Doha provide what Washington increasingly cannot: predictable policy, reliable partnerships, long-term commitments, and most importantly, respect for Canadian sovereignty rather than demands for submission. The world is watching as Canada demonstrates that mid-sized power with resources, capital, and strategic clarity can reduce dependence on unreliable superpower neighbor. Other nations facing American pressure are taking notes. Canada is not just surviving Trump's trade war. Canada is using it as catalyst to build economic autonomy that serves national interests regardless of who sits in Oval Office. Canada no longer needs to ask for permission